Hello, welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Popstar, Never Stop, Never Stopping, from 2016. Now, if you watched last week's video, you know that I watched MacGruber, and I talked extensively about the SNL problem and the problems with SNL in general and the problems with SNL movies in particular. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that this is fortunately not one of those movies for multiple reasons. I talked about how, I'll just recap concisely, that the problem with SNL movies is often they are a jumping off point where SNL has somebody somewhere in the SNL structure or in NBC or who knows, has decided that a particular skit off of SNL is worthy of turning into an entire movie, and it usually goes pretty badly. This is not that, in the sense that it is not off of a particular skit. It's also not quite a few years, I think, after The Lonely Island were no longer on SNL. But this does star all three, Andy, Akiva, and Jorma, with Andy being that they all wrote it together. Andy is the lead, with Jorma and Akiva being sort of secondary leads. And Jorma and Akiva are both, in addition to writers, directors, and producers on it as well. So this really has all three of them pretty heavily invested in it. I talked about The Lonely Island a little bit in the last video. As I've mentioned, they can be polarizing, and I understand. I like them generally. They've got their ups and downs for sure. And I think Andy is probably the most well-known, certainly these days, after starring in, 14 seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is very popular. And the fact that that show, went on to be as popular as it was, and his character was well liked and everything, I think goes to show that there's genuine talent there. It's not just some riding the coattails of SNL thing. I genuinely think that The Lonely Island are kind of underrated as a multi-artistic trio. They're all very multi-talented, in addition to just sort of how they started, which was making goofy music as friends and then getting hired onto SNL and then making a whole bunch of the digital shorts and things like that, some of which were like incredibly popular. And that really was the leaping off for their somewhat brief music career. I think they only had 3 albums, but they were solid. And since Andy has gone on to be a decently regarded actor, and Jorma and Akiva have both had their own director and producer credits and writing credits and all these other things, there's a lot of talent in here. And I genuinely think The Lonely Island itself as a musical group is kind of underrated for its I think it's easy to look at The Lonely Island and say, oh, they're mostly juvenile humor. And as somebody who's deeply critical of that kind of thing, I think there's a lot more interesting about what they write and how they write it. And I don't need to go into a musical analysis, but I think it parallels how they also write. They wrote for TV and how they wrote for movies and other things as well. And that a lot of the really quality stuff is sort of secondary to the surface level. Just to leap right into it momentarily, one of the things I like about this movie so much is that there's a lot of jokes that are on the surface kind of not very, they seem like they're not that smart, but in the context in which they're delivered, or the something about the setup, has a secondary layer to the joke that I think is what really made me cackle at some of these. I think overall, despite initial appearances, their writing, again, TV, music, and movies, is extremely dry. Their comedy is extremely dry, and pretty absurd, and often darker, a lot darker than it lets on, like on the surface, and that's what I really appreciate about it. And I think this movie does an excellent job of mixing the sort of comedy. I have a lot of problems with comedy films in general, especially in the last like 20 years. Well, no, before that they were terrible too. Lots of comedy films are real bad, and tend to sacrifice their structure, their plot, their pacing, any of the above, for the characterization, for the sake of the humor. And I think that Lonely Island and a lot of their projects in general manage to skirt that really well, where if you've only seen a trailer or something like that, I think it's easy to say, oh, doesn't have anything going for it, or it's not smart, or it's just too goofy or whatever. But contrary to a lot of those other SNL films, which I think really do lean towards the let's just knit a bunch of kind of sketchy skits together, sketchy sketches, and pretend and bookend it with a plot, and that's a movie. This manages to really get around that. Now, that's not to say that it's like shockingly in depth or anything. At its core, this is still a pretty light, pretty heavily comedic film. But the through line on the plot and the characterization is a lot of fun. And a lot of it is framed. The movie is essentially framed as a mockumentary, or like a satirization of a documentary, which I think serves their style really well in terms of like allowing them to sort of jump back and forth between the production versus the behind the scenes kind of thing, in a way that works really well with the comedic beats, in a way that feels natural and doesn't feel like they're tearing it up in favor of the comedy. The characters aren't crazy deep or anything like that, but they're well delivered. They're well written. I think all of the acting is really good. The cast in general, this is a massive cast. The Lonely Island have some sort of bizarre ability to have tons and tons of stars show up. And I'm sure part of that is just that, like, they were in the music industry and they also were on SNL and had a lot of visibility there. And, like, obviously a lot of the Lonely Island songs featured various musical artists at various times. Some of those guys who were on their albums came back for this. There's a whole bunch of new ones too. And there's some really big names on here. A shocking amount. And they're not there for huge amounts of time. And I don't say that just as a like, oh, look who they got. It's like they're actually there for a reason, and it really adds that sort of authenticity to the like that documentary style of like, you just have a whole bunch of famous musicians commenting on, very genuinely, it seems like they're all acting well on this, very genuinely commenting on, oh, like this we totally we love this group, or we love this guy, or here's my reflections on it. It's very reminiscent of something like The Last Dance or something like that. You know, a lot of the sort of things that have actually weirdly come after it, and this boom in popularity of documentaries. It's funny to see, like, I don't think they cribbed their style from this, but it's like the boom in documentaries came after this, after 2016. So it is, I'm not going to give any special credit, but it is bizarre how much of it they sort of nail before it's even really, really popular. So stylistically, I think it works really well, and structurally, I think it works really well. Like I said, the writing is very good overall. There's a few beats that I don't personally care for personal reasons. Like it's just like, is that joke? That joke is more gross than it is funny, or something like that. But they're like scattered, and they don't beat the jokes to death. For all of their very deliberate attempts to be comedic, The Lonely Island rarely beats their comedy to death, unless it is for the explicit reason of the like meta narrative of the absurdity of the thing in the first place, which is, to be fair, something they do rather often, but they always execute it really well. That said, if you don't care for The Lonely Island music, the comedy there, you're probably not gonna love this. It is a lot of the same structural stuff. I mean, that should be obvious from what I've said thus far, but just to be really clear, like, if you don't get anything out of either the old skits on SNL or their albums, then you might not want it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. I totally understand. But I appreciate a lot of what they do. Cinematically, I think it's actually really well done as well. This shows off Akiva Nyorma's skills far more than it showed off Yorma's directorship skills in MacGruber. And I don't know if that's a matter of the writing and how comfortable he may feel with like the particular content they're in. This is much more in line with what they'd been making for 15 years prior to this. So it may just be a natural thing, but they do some like genuinely smart, interesting, fun cinematography. And while still managing to fit it in the like sort of mockumentary style. Overall, I think it's also a satisfying narrative. The beginning to end, like I said, is not very complicated, but it's interesting enough and it's engaging. And while it's not super long, there's a whole bunch of musical stuff in here, rather obviously, and it's occasionally it's truncated, but they're like full songs, and they're good. They're well written. Even the short bits where it's like, we're only going to play you 15 seconds of this song. It's like, that's a well-produced song for whatever you may say about it. And sometimes they're deliberately bad because that's sort of the point. Like, that still really works. And it's a credit to, those guys that for 15, 20 years now, they've basically been making fun of the pop music industry while making basically nonstop bangers. It's like their production quality and the genuine musical talent that's there goes a really long way. And especially when the narrative that they're working on is you could look at it as a potential like alternate take on their own journey, with Andy being the one who's really blown up the most. That there's always conflict in any musical group or in any group of artists. And so like an alternative look on like how that could have potentially turned out or something like that, while also lampooning like pop the music industry and pop music and specific pop events, which admittedly they're not going to age badly, they're just not going to make as much sense. There's a whole bunch of references to like various things in the music industry that happened in the prior 5 to 10 years, that are not going to hit as well the more this goes on, but they're not going to age badly. It's not going to be like, what was that scene? They're just not going to hit quite as hard. And they're not used just for, again, they're not just used for the like, oh, I recognize that. That's funny because I recognize it. It's not that. It's like used for actual narrative reasons. And I think tying the like essentially cultural critique of the pop music industry and how like celebrity is treated is made all the more comprehensible, understandable, like biting by virtue of the specific events and people who they are clearly alluding to in some of these moments. Yeah, I mean, overall, like, I expected less. I genuinely did. And that's not, the things that this made me think about were, or the main thing this made me think about actually was 7 Days in Hell, which was, I think it was an HBO exclusive, that came out the year before in 2015, which was like another mockumentary style thing. It wasn't produced or directed or written by any of the guys, I think, but it stars Andy Samberg, and it's got a very similar tone. That dry humor. It's got a whole bunch of SNL people in it. But it's very like sort of biting and dark, and yet like not overwhelmingly so. And the mockumentary style works really well, and the sort of that patter, that rhythm works really well. I think that's sort of Andy's cup of tea. Just as a side note, I like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but not as much as a lot of people do, especially in the latter seasons. It devolves very much into, like, I'm not a big fan of sitcoms in general, and it's very sitcom-y. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. The like Band of Misfits thing is a much more modern take on it, but it does show, I think compared to something like this, which I think is where Andy shines, Brooklyn Nine-Nine can waver because I think he's a little bit too, I don't think he loves the very sitcom-y stuff. I don't think he works really well in that space. He may stick out at certain times. I don't think he has a really like broad, like his acting skills are not super broad. He does have some a sort of narrowness to his acting skills. I don't think he plays, as I've mentioned many times before, I don't think he plays a lot of characters that are too different from his own personality. But I think in that space, he works really well. And so something like Popstar, he has everything he needs there. Whereas something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, there are moments where it's just like, Andy looks kind of awkward in this scene. I don't think he's doing the sitcom thing because I don't think he likes it. Or maybe isn't totally suited toward it. But anyway, I digress. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this more than I thought I would. If you haven't seen 7 Days in Hell, it's also fun, especially if you know anything about tennis, which I'm not going to say I know a lot. I know a little, and it's fun. There's some weird nods. 7 Days in Hell is fun. This is pretty fun as well. It's, it's sort of a dumb comedy, slightly dark, cultural critique kind of thing, and I enjoy that kind of stuff. It's a lot more deep than a lot of the comedies that have come out in the last 40 years. So for an American comedy, for one that I think it's produced by Judd Apatow, who I think I've mentioned I'm not the biggest fan of, but despite that, it manages to escape a lot of the things I don't like about Apatow's work. Anyway, I think it's pretty good. If you don't hate The Lonely Island, you might like this. Let me know if you've seen it, or if you will watch it. Apparently it performed really poorly in theaters. No surprise there, actually. But I'm curious. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist. I'll see you guys next time.